All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our second panel of the workshop. I'm Riley Simmons-Edler. I'm one of the organizers, a postdoc at Harvard Kempner Institute. I'm going to be emceeing this session. So I will introduce our panelists and moderator. So I guess from this side, we have Aaron Luttman, who is a researcher at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, a multi-mission U.S. Department of Energy R&D facility. He focuses on bringing artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies to U.S. national security missions. Dr. Luttman's primary technical focus is on AI assurance, including safety, security, robustness, and vulnerabilities of AI models. Then we have Sarah. Yes, Sarah. I'm going to mispronounce this. Grand-Clément. Close enough. Researcher in the Security and Technology Program and the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. Her work examines the intersection of technology with conventional arms, exploring both the challenges and threats that technology can pose to international security, as well as the benefits it can bring to prevent violent conflict and enable peace. We have Branka Marijan. Apologies. A senior researcher at Project Plowshares who works on the military and security implications of emerging technologies. Her work examines ethical concerns regarding the development of autonomous weapon systems and the impact of artificial intelligence and robotics on security provision and trends in warfare. Then online, we have, from this side again, Andrew Reddie, the founder of the Berkeley Risk and Security Laboratory, UC Berkeley. His research is at the intersection of technology, politics, and security, and examines how emerging military capabilities shape the international order, with a focus on nuclear weapons policy, cybersecurity, AI governance, and innovation. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we have Vanina Martinez, tenured scientist at the Department of Logic and Reasoning at the IIIA CSIC. Since 2023, she has been a member of the UN Secretary General's Advisory Body on AI. Secretary General. UN Secretary General's Advisory Body on AI. Her research focus is in the area of knowledge representation and reasoning, with a focus on the formalization of knowledge dynamics, the management of inconsistent and uncertain information, and on the study of the ethical and social impact on the development and use of systems based on artificial intelligence. And last, of course, but very much not least, we have Shayne Longpre, our gracious moderator. Shayne is a senior PhD student at the MIT Media Lab who works at the intersection of AI and policy on responsible training, evaluation, governance for general-purpose AI systems. He leads the Data Provenance Initiative that audits, catalogs the sources of data sets used to train large models. And notably, his work has received 2 Best Paper Awards this year alone, as well as coverage in numerous media ventures. He also happens to be my co-author on our recent work on the risks of autonomous weapons for geopolitical stability and academic freedoms.
Awesome. Thank you, Riley. What wonderful introductions. And so to kick it off, it's a pleasure to be here with you all to dive a little bit deeper into the technical issues and responses to AI and military risks. And so we'd love if each of you could give maybe 5 minutes, maybe starting with you, Branka, on your perspectives here and your high-level prescriptions or anything that you feel like hasn't been spoken about enough on the technical side of things.
Thanks so much, everyone. It's so great to be on this panel with you. I spoke at length yesterday and discussed quite a few things that I wanted to address with you, but I do think there's a reason to put someone like me on a technical panel. And that's because, what we need to do essentially with the policies that we're developing, and I talked about this layered sort of governance that we need to develop for military use of AI. And one of those sort of key points is the integration of technical expertise with policy expertise. And Paul this morning talked about, trust and trustworthiness. I don't know if he specifically talked about trustworthiness, but we need to talk about trustworthiness. So we need to make sure that the systems that, we sort of say at the international level are okay to use and militaries start deploying are indeed properly designed, from the design phase on. So we talk about the life cycle, right, of weapon systems, that they are, that we ensure that they follow clear regulations and that they can be fielded, that they have been tested, that there are proper methodologies that are used. And this is in particular important for countries like Canada, which talk a lot about interoperability with other nations and allies. And at the international level as well, because we're talking about a great variance in capabilities among nation states. And so we need to ensure that from that even methodological discussion that, when you sort of see states deploying systems, that there has been consideration about the extent to which these systems function predictably, the extent to which there is understandability on behalf of the people that are deploying the systems, so that we have proper testing, training, evaluation, that there Misty Cummings has recently talked about this recertification of systems so that we don't deploy systems in one setting and then, take them to another that they've not been sort of properly trained for. And so I think these are all sort of critical aspects in my view. And central really for me in this sort of technical discussion, it is also this tricky question of explainability, right? So I looked at defense policies of various states on AI, even early ones, a few years ago, and everyone wants transparency, everyone wants explainability. Explainability in the international domain is very challenging, right? Because it's challenging technically, explainability, because these sort of approximations that you get from my understanding of technical AI research might be sufficient for certain contexts, but they're not sufficient for, safety critical contexts, for example. And so we need to figure out explainability for several reasons, and one of which is accountability. So we need to be able to hold people accountable for actions that are enabled in some way by AI systems or that are shaped by AI systems. So if a system makes some sort of decision, right? The system makes a decision. If the human using the system is making a decision, we do need a level of explainability, and that's my challenge to you. How do we do this technically? We need a level of explainability for ex post accountability, right? So if we're going to hold people accountable for war crimes, for things, for deployments of systems, there needs to be this sort of technical piece that has been very difficult. I know strides have been made in this AI research in the technical side, but we need that to be sort of sufficient enough for us on the legal and policy side to say we do in fact have accountable systems and we do in fact have transparency about how these systems function. And not just internal transparency for states and militaries, but also external transparency. How do we communicate that these systems have been properly tested and evaluated? I'll end there, and then we can talk more later.
I wonder if we should alternate between remote and in-person. So Vanina, would you like to go next?
Sure, I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for this invitation. This is really great to be here with these wonderful people. I couldn't assist yesterday to any of the talks, but I've seen some of the talks today, and it's really, really interesting, everything that I've been hearing. So, we have been listening a bit. Branka was mentioning this idea of trust for the deployment, the use in general of AI systems in the military domain. I tend not to like the word trust that much, trustworthiness, not because it's not useful, but as a technical person, I think that it could be a too abstract notion to actually then be able to guarantee a certain, to give guarantees on what we expect from the behavior of the system itself or the users around the systems that are AI enabled. So, in particularly when we talk about critical systems, I think that there are more, right? But the two more important things that we make sure we have technical warranties on are a successful or a correct assessment of the risks that particular instances of deployment of those AI models may have when they're actually functioning, and how to assign responsibilities, right? And this I agree completely with my colleague here. There are a lot of issues related to how do we actually can assign responsibilities in a way that the different stakeholders can be held accountable for every of these actions. And I will explain a bit more about later, but I think that there are several terms that we've been using and in other fora related to responsible AI, and has to do, and I think they are very, very important here when we are talking about the use of military the use of AI in the military domain, and have to do with predictability and comprehensibility of the whole system, right? This is not about the model of the different models of AI that are being placed in the software system, but it also has to do with the humans around it, in every part, in every step of the cycle of the system, and also in the context, a specific context where the systems are going to be deployed. And in this sense, I'm somehow establishing that comprehensibility is the stepping stone for accountability and assignment of responsibility. And then I was going to say another thing, but related to what Branka said about explicability, I think we have been discussing this for some years about when and how do we need a system to be explainable. From my point of view, the places where AI can be used in the military domain are absolutely broad, like in any other domain. But I don't think that explainability may be necessary in exactly the same way in every of these parts. And explainability in AI is a very young field of research. And I agree that we've been focused on many of the technical issues related to explicability of the performance of the system, and not in a broader sense, and that needs to be taken into account. But just to wrap up, and then we can continue the discussion. I think that this of just not thinking of the AI model as what has to be measured or controlled or specified, but to think of the whole socio-technical system that the use of any AI model, but particularly, like I said, in critical processes that could be many of the uses or the tasks in the military domain, we need to be able to understand in depth this combination of actors, the model, the users, every stakeholder involved in the whole life of the product, and also the context and the different contexts where the system is going to be used.
Awesome, thank you, Vanina. Sarah, I'd love to hear from you next. also, how do we do a comprehensive socio-technical evaluation well? Just to prompt you a bit.
Thanks. I'll try to answer your question, but I think just to jump on also what Branka and Vanina said are very excellent points. I think lots there that I would also have expressed myself. And indeed, I think technical issues is an extremely important topic because it's not whether AI is going to be embedded in the military domain. It's not a hypothetical, it is embedded. So we do need to discuss these issues, understand the limitations, understand the barriers, especially when it comes to issues of accountability, responsibility, and broader IHL. And I think taking also a perspective of what decision makers, what policy makers need to understand when it comes to technical issues is, what can these systems realistically achieve, but also what are their barriers and limitations, so that they can create adequate policies. They can, when they go into the UN processes or other, a lot of the discussions have been outside of the UN right now. So, but so that they can also make, and their discussions can be adequate and informed, and not based on hype, but also not underestimating the capabilities of these systems. And I think this is really important because there's so much information out there. There's an information overload for policymakers, but there's also a lack perhaps of translating from the expert community who works on these systems to a non-technical community. And I think that's really important and really critical. Also to understand where the research is going, but without necessarily going into kind of things that might seem possible in the future, but right now are not realistic. So sometimes we hear a lot of talk about AGI, but really explaining it to policymakers, what is possible, what is realistic, which are the directions we're going in, and what perhaps technical limitations we may think that we can overcome, and what we cannot, and what we may have to live with. So that's the first kind of set of issues. I think there is an understanding within the policymaker community about the brittleness of AI systems, that they can't be used to kind of, that they are task specific, that they can't be generalizable. And I think that's quite important to stress, that they're not, they may seem deceptively capable, but I think that's a really important element to kind of really center the debate on kind of the non-hype, essentially. And I think really also what was mentioned before by Marijan and Vanina is the environment, I think, is also not just like, I know there's a lot of technical issues with the AI systems themselves, but also the environment can generate technical issues. And I touched upon some of that yesterday in my talk, but thinking about what may be limiting the use of these systems and within the military domain, in terms of computational power, in terms of energy requirements, etc. Also thinking about the security risks, which impose some technical limitations. So the trade-offs between perhaps speed or necessity to kind of implement safety measures, I think that's really also important to understand. And I think, and pertaining also to a question that was posed yesterday, which I found was really excellent. I apologize, I can't remember who asked it, which is what differentiates AI to other weapons and other weapons with developments we've seen in the past. And I think this also relates to training, evaluation, validation, verification, etc. Of these systems, whereby the main difference is that these systems learn and develop beyond what their initial capabilities, or when they were initially developed, one might have expected that that they can undertake. So I think there's something there where technical issues don't just end; they may be ongoing, and I think that's something very different for the community. That's for arms control community in terms of dealing with these ongoing issues that don't just stop at the point at which these systems have been reviewed and validated, and that new problems might emerge overall. I think I'll stop there, although I don't think I've answered your question. Okay.
Andrew, would you like to go next?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Shayne. And thanks to Christian, Alexander, and Mila for organizing this timely and important conversation. Apologies, the end of the semester here at Berkeley, so I got stuck in the classroom instead of getting to be with you all, but delighted to be a part of the crew. Just one word before I start. All of my remarks are bounded by being focused primarily on narrow applications of AI in military context, so not dealing with the AGI problem, and we can probably speak at length in a better venue with beer over whether that's a thing that we should be worried about or not. But that's kind of where my remarks live. Kind of three major buckets for the conversation. One is what the military thinks these technologies are buying them. And really in the context of an enabling technology. So to Sarah's point there, it's not, the challenge that we have is it's not a missile system that we're trying to actually deal with here. It's something that actually ends up poking at various different parts of the kill chain, if you want to use the military parlance. And then I'll talk a little bit about kind of where we have these systems being used in the military today, and then use cases kind of moving forward. So from the perspective of the militaries around the globe, and that's kind of where I'll kind of focus my remarks, kind of giving you their perspective, it's kind of worth thinking about what these systems buy you. And so there's kind of three characteristics that the military think that are desirable in this context. One is speed, so being able to do things faster. Indeed, all of my students now write essays much more quickly than they used to, with thanks to ChatGPT. So right there's a basket of activities that they think can be increasing the efficiency of each individual warfighter that they have at their disposal. You also have efficiencies in terms of, for example, for an intelligence analysis problem, taking discrete streams of intelligence information, whether it be image intelligence or signals intelligence or human intelligence, and munging that insight into a single operator's terminal such that they can give you again an insight that comes from these disparate streams more quickly than might otherwise be the case. Indeed, it's traditionally been the case that you have specialized intelligence agencies for each different type of intelligence, and so you'd have a signals intelligence operator, human intelligence operator, and then all of their insights would have to percolate upwards through a chain. Now I can get rid of some of that chain as you get between the policymaker or decision maker on one hand and the intelligence operative on the other. So you've got efficiency gains as well. And then finally, the emergent properties. And so I think this obviously came to the fore around the time of AlphaGo, and a military strategist said, well, this is really neat. What are kinds of new strategies and doctrines can I deploy using these types of technologies? But they do cut against what Branka was talking about in terms of explainability or auditability, or what the DoD AI principles describe as traceability. And ultimately, you have to think about when you actually need the explainability versus when you don't. If you've got failure modes that are fairly innocuous, you probably don't need it. You certainly don't need it in real time. And so I think there's also a temporal element to this as well. So explainability kind of in real time as in deploying a model for a particular use case versus being able to, over the months after, figure out, okay, this is actually how the model was serving the operator, and this is how the operator was making decisions. And so those are the three kind of major characteristics that I think are driving military uptake. And of course, on the other side of it, there's kind of this race to the bottom dynamic where there's a fear on the part of any particular military that another military is going to be deploying these tools and being able to use them better on the battlefield, all else equal. And so that's kind of the environment in which we find ourselves. Now, in terms of how these systems are already deployed, they've been used in the context of early warning and communication pathing for nigh on 6 decades. Anytime you want something to operate autonomously. Now, for better or for worse, in the military AI integration space, we've collapsed a lot of the distinctions between autonomy, algorithmic decision making, AI, etc., and that can be for better or for worse. But certainly, early warning, that's something that's been used in nuclear command and control, for example, for a long time. And that's specifically things like signal detection algorithms or anomaly detection algorithms that say, hey, look, adversary is doing something strange here. And so we've been doing that for a long time, and that ends up percolating through the early 2000s when we start using some of these tools for predictive logistics and maintenance, places that are comparatively data rich and where the failure modes are not so significant, so that if things go wrong, you're not leading to kinetic effects that actually yield casualties. Now, of course, there's contemporary concerns that will move this over into actually kinetic kill vehicles that are entirely autonomous. There is a little bit of a lie in this conversation that Sarah's already brought up that I think is a good one, which is that we kind of pretend in the governance conversation as if we've yet to pass the Rubicon. But I would submit to you Vincent Bullenin's work with CIPRI, right, where they're trying to count the number of autonomous systems. It is the case that missile defense would not work if they had a human in the loop. And so we've already deployed some of these assets. And ultimately, a missile defense vehicle, right, has a different warhead on it. Well, it usually doesn't have a warhead on it at all, but it's very easy to retrofit and actually make that into any other kind of missile in terms of technical limitations. And so we're looking to the future and what's kind of interesting now. I tend to think about this space very much in terms of use cases rather than technical toolkits, because I think that's probably where we're going to have a regulatory or governance conversation. But really, it's decision support. That's the interesting stuff, right? And that's where you have a lot of militaries thinking about, well, how do I kind of buy those speed gains, buy those efficiency gains, and get insights and then deliver strategy more quickly. And so the first and most obvious place for this is intelligence analysis for the process of early warning, but also in wargaming applications. I say as the wargame designer in the room, and so I'm kind of predisposed towards thinking about this space. But there's all sorts of work, at least inside of the U.S. context, focused on how to think about using AI tools for wargaming, both in terms of training and analysis capabilities. And so you've got Ben Jensen at CSIS thinking about AI versus AI players. Our group at Berkeley is really focused on using AI tools to architect games more quickly and actually being able to spin up more and more test beds to test different types of strategies and doctrines. But either way, that's kind of a space that we don't talk about often that I think is pretty interesting. You also have the decision support archetype that's in the TLDR YouTube video that I'm sure all of you have watched from the Future of Life Institute, where you actually have a model providing potential decisions to a decision maker in a given scenario. And then, of course, targeting conversations, which came to the fore in the context of Israel-Gaza, right? So what kinds of effects do I want to maximize? What kind of effects do I want to minimize? What constitutes a legitimate military target? The issue, if you will, with particularly the TLDR type of story is that there are actually no data sets that you could reasonably use to make decisions at the higher rungs of escalation when it comes to conflict. So, right, I'm a political scientist. Paul, also in the room, is a political scientist. And so we have the correlates of war. It's coded by graduate students, and bless my graduate students. I wouldn't trust them to make decisions about when you should be, embarking on a cyber attack or embarking upon a nuclear low yield attack or what have you. And so I think one of the issues there is thinking about, well, where is your data going to be coming from to actually feed the model to give you the insight that this is what you're supposed to be doing. And I don't think that we can kind of take it as a given that you've got militaries around the world that are going to be comfortable with using certainly the data sets that already exist, but also synthetic data generating tools like war games or simulations and models to make those decisions at the very higher echelons of conflict. But of course, where they are used, you worry about automation bias, which I think the TLDR video does a really good job of demonstrating, where you've got humans kind of in theory on the button, right? But in reality, just saying yes, 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 yes. And so you certainly do worry about that context as well. One of the other things I'll flag before I close is that where we do see militaries implementing these tools, they have tended to implement the open models, which is potentially like Llama 3.1, 3.2. And that's potentially problematic insofar as you're worried about data poisoning concerns. So where you do see the deployment of these models, one of the things to consider as a norm is whether you want to make some sort of tacit agreement that you're not going to fiddle with the use of another military's toolkit if you know that they've used Llama 3.1 and you have access to all of the training data and all the model parameters, etc. Because the data poisoning risk certainly is something that keeps me up at night. That paradigm's changing somewhat because now you actually have militaries around the world giving approval for using some of the closed models from the likes of Microsoft or OpenAI, but that's certainly something that was relatively easy to spin up in a classified environment, and so that's what a lot of militaries around the globe did. And of course, you're bringing in all of those weaknesses or foibles associated with those models in that context as well. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to the Q&A, and thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Andrew. Aaron?
Well, it doesn't seem fair that I should have to go after these four speakers. I want to start off just by giving you a little baseline of why I'm sitting here. So the US government does not have a centralized science and technology workforce. Various and sundry agencies have various and sundry scientists, but the largest by far is within the US Department of Energy's National Laboratory Complex. So we have 17 national laboratories with 40 to 50,000 scientists and engineers. And we are the predominant AI workforce for the US government. And so I personally work at an organization where we support the Department of Homeland Security, which is like border crossings and things like that. We work for all of the agencies that deal with security of the electrical grid. We work for the intelligence community, and of course we work for the Department of Defense and all of the branches of the military. So my job is literally building AI systems for the military. So I don't know, I'm probably the only one in the room who has that job. I spent about 20 years as an actual researcher. I'm a mathematician by training. Now I really actually serve the role that Sarah was describing, and I'm the person who has to translate between our code developers and our sponsors, the non-technical people who don't understand if you start getting too far into the weeds, which all of our scientists, of course, love to do. I've really enjoyed being here because obviously I don't spend a lot of my time in these policy forums. But the thing that really struck me yesterday is that we really had two conversations that were going on in parallel, whether it was deliberate or unwitting. So the first was autonomous weapon systems. And from a technological standpoint on the AI side, this is essentially entirely convolutional neural networks. So you actually look at the systems that are deployed. They're not even vision transformers, they're CNNs. So why is this a big part of our discussion today? Why do you see it in the news? You see it in the news because this is a technology that was developed about 10 years ago. Well, how long does it take to actually deploy something into a military scenario? It takes about 5 to 8 years. And so why are we talking about CNN technology? Because that's what's been around long enough to actually get deployed into the military systems. The other conversation we had, which was, I think fair to say, really only driven by Professor Bengio, was risks and harms of the futuristic AGI, ASI, we're all gonna die. I don't think I recall having addressed really any of those large scale risks. I'm sure David in the back's not happy with us that we haven't talked a lot more about that. But what I would like to actually bring up from a technology standpoint is something that is in between those two. So it's not the 10 years ago, and it's not the 10 to 20 to infinite years from now. It's the AI technologies that have actually been developed, really LLMs, in the last, we're 3 years into LLMs, really. And so what does that mean for deploying this into military systems? It means that we're 2 to 5 years out before those are really becoming predominant. And I was telling some people, I think I'm probably the most boring person to be on any of the panels or presentations here, because what's the moral of that story? If LLMs are going to become the predominant technology from a risk and policy standpoint, this is going to be very uninteresting for all of you, because now what we're really going to be talking about are the things that Sarah presented yesterday. We're not going to be talking about autonomous weapon systems. We're going to be talking about the US military. Well, I'm from the US, so I think about the US military. What is the US military? It is the largest producer of PowerPoint slides in the world. It is a gigantic bureaucracy. So where are the gains that we're really going to see from AI in the military environment? And it's not just going to be in the US, it's going to be literally around the world in everyone's militaries. What we're going to see is we're going to start seeing operational changes that are really dramatic from LLMs in the bureaucratic side. It's really going to be, how do I take a million, literally, this is not exaggeration. I mean, we have sponsors that come to us with 1 million PowerPoint slide decks. And by the way, they're probably in something like 10,000 different folders. And they say, we want AI. And you sit down and you look at the data and it's like, well, actually, no. What you need here is actually something to process 1 million PowerPoint slide decks, which isn't the sexy side of things, but it's actually transformational and it can make a really big difference in operations. From the policy standpoint, like I said, it's really not sexy because I think maybe someone could argue that people have died from PowerPoint, but it's probably not a thing we're going to talk about an international treaty on. And so I think when we start coming at it from the technology standpoint, I think what we're going to see is over the next several years, maybe the harm and risk discussion is actually going to get minimized because the places where we're seeing AI really make the transformational differences aren't the things that actually demand international agreements and binding legal regimes. So I just want to add one more comment quickly, just in response to Paul's presentation. And that was, I think, it sounded like maybe there was some skepticism about the results of military personnel not trusting AI. They don't. And if you think about it, you're going to remember, military people are people first and foremost. And so think about the transformation that's happening with AI. Do authors like large language models? No, it's going to take our jobs. If you're a playwright, do you like large language models? No, it's going to take our jobs. I'm the expert, AI can't do that. Well, guess what? Military people are exactly the same. And so Andrew was talking about intelligence systems. Well, in the military, a lot of the intelligence operations are actually carried out. It's in junior enlisted people sitting at a computer. And a lot of their self-worth comes from the fact that actually they do their job pretty well. And so now you come in and say, okay, but you have your 30 streams of data. You can't really process them, but I can give you an AI system that can and can accelerate your job. Do you think they're saying, oh yeah, get rid of me? Like, no, of course not. They don't trust it at all because they have to be able to see that a machine can perform and actually make their life easier. So there's this initial, their trust is very low. They do not want to deploy. Now, I think that's still a little bit different than when you're out in the field and there's a targeteer who's pressing a button. That person doesn't actually have the luxury of choosing whether or not they trust the system. And so when you talk about the trust in the system for the person in the field, on the battlefield who's pressing a button, trust really isn't the right topic. But when you're talking about deployment of systems and how do they get approved to begin with, then trust is really important, and they mostly don't trust. Okay, I'm going to leave it there.
Awesome, those are fantastic, and some great jumping off points. Let's start a little bit by talking about specific examples. I think that's something that we heard yesterday. It'd be great to dive into, come up with examples that you think would just sort of add some character to the conversation. And so my first question is, what specific technical applications do you think are most concerning going forward? And Aaron, you started to talk about this, and maybe some that are also promising, perhaps, if governed correctly. And sort of the question in the back of my mind I'd love to ask is, to what extent are these applications that are concerning or promising enabled by advances in general purpose AI, or were they there all along? I'll go first really quickly, having the mic. A couple of years ago, I was part of a team that released a general purpose AI model about the quality of GPT-2, and a few months later, it turned up, it was an open weights model, given Andrew's comment, so it turned up in a demo for battlefield planning by a military adjacent company, bringing you the military intelligence of answers.com and maybe, a couple of pieces of Reddit. So we were obviously very concerned by hoping no one would dare deploy this. But I think this sort of talks a little bit about your comment, Sarah, about deceptively capable and how there's so much hype around these technologies. Will some of them, if governed properly, bring us some of the qualities they promise, or is there too much hype and people think that these technologies are the ones that are going to bring us advances as opposed to others? Anyway, there's 10 questions in one, but let me hand it off to whoever wants to go first.
I can speak first I don't know which question I'd rather choose. You've given us sort of a menu, but I think one of the applications, and maybe this is where I can hear more from Aaron on this. I mean, what I'm really concerned about, like presently, and I think I'm on the side of I don't think we need to worry about AGI, and you might all, replace me in about 20 years with a much more capable policy analyst, but for now, that's not the concern. I think what's the concern now, looking at contemporary warfare and the theaters that we're looking at, in Gaza and Ukraine and other places, it is several things. So one is the decision support systems, right? And that's the boring stuff, seemingly, right, of like data analysis. But the data that's being analyzed is decisions about people's lives, ultimately, right? Like, are you the target? And is the target appropriate? And if that human decision maker has 20 seconds, and only even then to just confirm that the target is male, because that's what we're reading about, right, in the investigative reporting, like clearly, that's a huge concern. And that's a concern, I think, because I live in Canada, we're sitting in Canada, some of this is very distant, but if I think and reflect on the conflicts that, like I grew up in and stuff, it's kind of thinking about what are the implications of that kind of data in like an ethnicized conflict, right? Like with ethnic identities, an issue, and, who's going to be chosen as the appropriate, I don't know if this is as the appropriate multiple mics, okay, this one works. As the appropriate target. Like that to me is a real concern. Like where is the concern? Yes, it's boring. Yes, it's data analysis, but what data is being analyzed? Who's being impacted? And I absolutely agree with Vanina and Sarah, and I think like everyone on the panel has mentioned this. It's the context, right? So the reality, I think this is frustrating sometimes to technical experts, like you want to build the best system technically, but then humans use it, and we mess things up. We mess things up for self-driving vehicles. We do unpredictable things. I don't know if you've ever driven around Toronto, but good luck putting an autonomous vehicle in that area. We just do unpredictable things, and especially in highly stressful, emotional contexts, like war zones. And I think I've said this line before, but war doesn't provide lab conditions, so you have to kind of be able to anticipate all of those things. And I'll end there, but I just want to highlight this point of some of the boring stuff is very concerning. And I think we really need to be thoughtful about deploying the systems, even sort of the models that we have now to analyze data or generate data. Particularly, in war, it's not about just random thoughts that ChatGPT can give you to support your arguments at a bar discussion on politics with your friends. It's really about things that matter for people's lives.
And really quick follow-up, do you think that decision support systems that you're most concerned about are increasingly powered by general purpose AI language models, or are they more traditional models?
I think there's a mix that's happening. What it worries me is if you're a smaller state that can't, employ the Anthropics and OpenAI, that doesn't have them at your disposal, like you might cobble together systems that are available. And that this could also be done by non-state armed groups, which is a concern for states, right? Not all non-state armed groups are, fighting in forests and things, right? Like some of them are more capable in various countries. So I think there's the geopolitical context as well that we have to consider with these, but I think it's a mix at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always so hard to follow Branka because she always covers all the most excellent points. But to add to that, and I think jumping on also something you mentioned about smaller states, I think indeed the adoption of AI, I think we've talked about it from a very Western perspective, but it's true that AI is being adopted across the board, but it's not a one-size-fits-all, so you won't see the same adoption occurring in every state. But adoption is happening, but it may not be to the same extent or for the same purposes. There may be different appetites, different abilities to adopt it, etc. And I think that drives a lot of the kind of it's difficult to provide an answer on what AI capabilities exist because it will depend what state or what actor you're talking about. So for some states, it's including it just simply a navigational, to help navigating ships, or also thinking about contexts of conflict. It's just very practical reasons. If there's electronic warfare, it's to overcome those issues. It's from a very kind of practical, operational standpoint. So I'm faced with this issue, and I'm going to employ something to overcome it. And it's also, I think, jumping on what you said as well, Aaron and Branka, it's these support systems, data analysis, those really important elements. Trying to recall the menu of questions, but I think you also mentioned kind of promising and concerning aspects of use of the technologies, and here it's also just considering the fact that AI in itself doesn't have like a kinetic impact. It's could be used with other elements which then have a kind of physical impact on the world, so kinetic impact. And I think it's important to consider that within these discussions. So, for example, how does it kind of work within the system of systems, as we talked before, and how does that have a practical impact on troops that get deployed, or weapons that are used, or effects of weapons used, and in what context these weapons are used, urbanized environments or not. Maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, just because Sarah opened it up, I think it is useful to think a little bit about kind of where some of these new models are providing. And so I think a lot of us in the room, and certainly on the panel as well, have likely played the role of red teamer for any number of the companies that are deploying these models in the context of CBRN risks. And one of the things that we should probably be doing is building a tighter discipline for what red teaming actually looks like when you're trying to think about what are the batteries of tests that a model needs to get through. Some of this conversation to me is reminiscent of some of the discussion we were having in the cyber domain about the capability potentially being a weapon of the week. And it's not really something we ended up observing in the real world in terms of like proliferating the capability of smaller states or non-state actors. In reality, it ended up reifying the power of the Chinas and the United States of the world, rather as providing a new opportunity for the Philippines or what have you. And so I think one of the things that will be kind of interesting to track is the degree to which these technologies actually do speed up the proliferation cycle for chemical, radiological, nuclear, etc. It is the case that I can send my students to the library here on campus, and they can learn how to build certainly a gun-type nuclear weapon relatively trivially. And so I think one of the discussions we'll be watching is seeing kind of where these risks actually lie and who the actors are that are ultimately going to be able to implement them. But one of the challenges, of course, is that the barrier to entry for access to Claude, right, is vanishingly low. That license costs very little. And so I think any engineer or scientist in any military worth their salt is looking at kind of, well, how do I think about leveraging these massive technologies? Aaron's right. I think at last count, there's like 96 offices across USG that are doing the AI office of blank. So a wonderful way to get a promotion if you're inside of the U.S. government. But yeah, I think you got various people trying to figure out, right, for their particular job function or use case, like, is this something that we want to do? And so that's on the new model side. And on the old model side, it's still the case that if you want to get funding here, AI NC3, right? A whole bunch of folks are still focused on it. I'm a little bit skeptical. I've got a colleague, Adam Lowther, who's made the argument multiple times that we should be thinking about deploying AI dead hand systems of our own, following Perimeter and some of the Russian conversations around Poseidon. So that's something else as well. But that's an old model, but very big problem if you don't want to put it inside of this bucket. So 2 comments for me. Thanks so much.
Vanina, sure.
Yes. So I want to answer to everybody. I'll try that too. I couldn't agree more about the decision support systems that could be developed. I think, and one of the worries that I have it's not just in the military domain, but you see it in other critical domains and non-critical domains. How this looking for efficiency and doing things more like faster and in principle more accurate from a performance point of view. I worry that it's kind of like shortening the steps that are set for specific tasks within the domain, right? Like upstream task and downstream task in the military domain could very easily now all converge into just one system that can combine a lot of information, as Andrew was saying, from different sources, and in a very efficient, time-wise window, decides things like should this person be killed or not, right? I'm not saying that processes should not change due to the appearance when new technology appears that can help, but those steps are there for a reason. And in particular, the reasons are that behind that is responsibility, assignment of responsibility, accountability, and making sure the guarantees on the some types of guarantees on the output of the process. So this is, like I said, this is not just a problem for the military domain that I see, but do with that, and all of them are human decisions, right? This has nothing to do with the technology itself. It has to do on why and when we decide to use AI and how we design and propose new ways of solving existing problems. Just one comment that I wanted to make about what Aaron and Andrew were saying about the old models, right? Well, it's very interesting that we don't have really formal warranties for those old models, right? So we are thinking about the new ones and all the problems that the new ones could or could not bring us. And I guess it is a very good thing that only old models, the CNNs, are being used, but still there is no formal guarantees on their behavior. And all the technical issues that have been mentioned and that we can mention here still apply for them. And so it's a very open questions everywhere. One last thing, that just to be a bit more on the bright side, I think a very promising area that I actually like very much and could solve a lot of the other problems that we have in this domain has to do with using AI for training and education. Andrew mentioned some of these applications using simulations, using games. I think this is very, very interesting. It has been done for some time already, but it could be a very good way where other properties such as understandability or explainability can be taken down to the actual users or the people that are going to design or implement the systems or actually use them in either in the battlefield or in administrative tasks. And just another very, very last thing regarding how I think Sarah started mentioning that, and then Andrew said something about it's not really the case that small countries are really using this, right? I mean, and this is one of the problems with in the way we are deploying AI in every domain. AI today is actually increasing the gaps from economical, technological, political point of view, and especially in this kind of capabilities. And it's this is cannot be fixed by having access to specific models or to some type of data. It's a very profound issue that has to do. That we have to think if we really want to make AI available for everybody, that everybody can actually gain from it, and that's from my side.
I'll just give a quick response to the first question that was asked, which was applications, and there are two particular applications that I am a little bit surprised haven't been more central to the discussion here, and that is mis and disinformation, which is already like fully deployed. There are many militaries around the world who have extensive infrastructures. I mean, like large workforces whose sole job is building mis and disinformation campaigns and executing them. So that's already out there. And then also cyber, which, and these two were both discussed just minimally yesterday, but cyber is another place where, chatbots, which in some sense you could think of them as a kind of AI, I mean, that's really changed the way that the way people, not we like me or any of the people I work with, but the way that cyber attacks are deployed, and we're really lacking in good research on how to use AI to build better cyber defenses. And so I'm gonna take that and sort of piggyback on something that Branka said, and that was that these other sort of non-gun type uses of AI still have potential harms and risks, and we still need to think about what do we need to do to secure that. And so that's totally correct, we need to do that. And I would say to all of you in the room who are computer scientists or mathematicians or people who are actually in the AI industry, this is a big call for us to actually be building the scientific underpinnings that the policymakers can use to make their decisions about whether or not they deploy something. We can't just hand them a model and then expect a policymaker to be able to make a decision about whether a model is deployable or not if it's just the model itself. We have to be able to provide justification for why a model should be deployable.
Awesome set of examples. Before we move on to the public Q&A, there's one more I really wanted to ask. So maybe we can do 20 seconds each if possible, rapid fire. As a language model researcher, there's been a huge appetite in our community and even a movement to increase transparency and independent oversight of these general purpose AI systems and their development and deployment by corporations like OpenAI, Anthropic, et cetera. This transparency and oversight is mostly for the public, the AI community, civil societies. To what extent can we replicate this in military contexts where that information is much more sensitive? Maybe we'll do reverse order so we don't have to follow Branka.
I told Shayne that if he asked me a question that I wasn't going to answer, I would just dodge in real time. 20 seconds dodge.
I think if it's me next, on use cases, I think there's a lot of opportunity for transparency. On the in-house technical capabilities, next to zero, except for where there's broad agreement among multiple countries that sharing technical information, particularly regarding testing and evaluation, will drive down the risk of inadvertent escalation and accidents. So that's where I would see the space for technical sharing.
Vanina?
Well, to be honest, I don't have a very strong position on this. As a scientist, I'm all about open science and being a computer scientist, open source, open code, open models, and open everything. I understand that in this kind of domains, this is very difficult, and it's very, even if it is very difficult, even if we could, it's very difficult to actually people to get on board with it, probably. We don't really know from a technical point of view what a open or what kind of the different types of transparencies and AI model, when we look at the whole system itself, really mean. right? And I've seen a lot of discussions around the topic, and there is kind of like this people talk about different things when they talk about transparency and openness on the models or the systems themselves. I tend to believe what Andrew said in more technical and very nice words, that I tend to believe that if we could, the more we can agree, like countries can agree on models of part of the models that can be shared and can be open, if they can agree on that, I think that it actually would make reduce escalation, and also help prepare ourselves in terms of defense, right? Because then we work in from an adversarial point of view, we know what's out there. So those are my more than 20 seconds. Sorry about it.
Okay. I would echo what was said before. It's transparency about what and for whom. I think that's two really important points. I'm not suggesting I have the answers about that, but I think what Andrew already suggested is a really good starting point for that. I would, however, point to the parallels with regards to other disarmament and arms control regimes, because I think that's a really good way of understanding kind of how this is being considered in other domains, be that conventional or WMD. And transparency is really seen as a confidence-building measures between states. Indeed, and I'm more of a conventional arms person, so I'll speak more to the conventional side, but make also references to WMDs, and apologies if I'm abusing my 20 seconds. But on the conventional side, transparency is seen as really being key to minimize destabilization, to understand capabilities that states have, and to prevent weapons accumulation. In WMDs, of course, that also depends on the regimes. For example, on the chemical weapons regime, it's a lot more integrated in the convention, whereby there are kind of monitoring, verification, kind of elements included within it, but transparency is seen as a key component within arms control processes. So I think there probably are some lessons learned about what is being, or what has already been done in more kind of institutionalized, for other weapons types, these more institutionalized processes, and what can be replicated and learned when it comes to new technologies. But I think that still remains, of course, the open question of transparency about what is it, capabilities, is it effect, and what is important to be transparent about.
I'm so glad I got discussion, because I'm supposed to have a paper shortly published by the Center for International Governance Innovation. And indeed, in that military AI series, there's a paper by Sarah also that you should read, and precisely titled, Through a Glass Darkly, Transparency in Military AI. And I think one of the things going through the literature there, what I found is that transparency means different things to different people. So very much what Vanina and Sarah were saying, and what transparency means in the arms control discussions is a little bit, is quite different actually than in what it means in the technical discussions when we get into explainability and predictability, all of that I discussed earlier. And what's really interesting about these elements of transparency is that countries want the transparent systems, and countries want transparent systems internally, right? But it's the external transparency that we struggle with. So what's really important about what Sarah said is that we do have confidence building measures in place. People, I think Paul mentioned Mike Horowitz, Paul Schray, they've written about sort of how do we do confidence building measures on military AI. And it might be something as simple as sharing the way in which sort of testing and evaluation or something is like a broad process. Of course, not wanting wanting to expose, things that are somewhat secret, and very much what I think Andrew was saying as well. That sort of is where we can build the transparency, and particularly, I think, acknowledging the challenging geopolitical environment for multilateralism. Sort of that question of like, what do we work on in the next, 4 years of an unpredictable U.S. administration, challenges, between the United States and China and others. And it's really it's that the necessary confidence building that we need to see happen between these more adversarial states on these topics, and having those kinds of exchanges as well. And I think one of the funny consequence of the LLMs, I just saw that the Russian security services have renamed espionage as network marketing. I thought that was a very nice evolution of how maybe we think about some of the implications of AI in the disinformation and misinformation space, and I'll leave it there.
Awesome, thank you. Let's open up to public Q&A. I'd love if each question could direct it to one or two of the panelists, if possible.
Yeah, so this is about AGI and superintelligence. I think this is a really important part of the conversation. So, Aaron, you mentioned taking maybe 5 to 10 years for technologies to be adopted. Branka, you said maybe in 20 years you can imagine somebody doing your job, or an AI doing your job. It takes even longer than 5 to 10 years to do things like have international agreements banning certain technologies. So if we don't want super intelligent AI generals running the entire military operations and stuff, we probably need to start now. I think the timelines are often a distraction. On the other hand, there's also a growing number of experts who are forecasting this happening, much sooner than that, within, let's say, years, rather than decades. And yeah, I don't want to derail the conversation here, because I think everything else that's been discussed is really important as well. I just think we do need to at least acknowledge or grapple with this issue, and ideally, I would like more people to be really thinking about, the end game here as AI systems do surpass human capabilities, which I think, is going to happen at some point, maybe quite soon. So I'm just looking for thoughts on that, on the end game.
I think that was for you, Aaron, unless you want to pass it off. Or Andrew, I think, wants to.
I can let Aaron give it a crack first if he wants. But I have 2 cents I can add.
Yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
So one of the things that would help, academic in this space, political scientist by training, engaging a lot in Washington. One of the things that would help me a lot in having the AGI, ASI conversation is a real milestone marker in terms of what are the technical milestones that you're going to reach in order to get yourself to that ASI space, where I can make an argument to the policymaker, hey, look, we're moving over these stepping stones one by one. Because right now, all that I have when I walk into that conversation is smart people in the CS space tell us that this is something we should be worried about. And to be quite frank, that does not pass the bar for policymakers to take this seriously. They need empirical things that they can go out and say, yep, I'm looking at this amount of compute. I'm looking at this amount of, the model performance looks like this, and this is an indicator that we're moving down the field towards this AGI, ASI. So, whilst I have all of you in the room, that's what I'll say. Look, we have to have a technical marker conversation, not a, smart people in the field say so, because forecasting does not move the needle when you're going to go and talk to the government agencies, or indeed intergovernmental agencies. And so that's one of the major calls to action that I would have, is to think seriously about what those mile markers actually look like.
Yeah, so I just want to mention that I think there has been a lot of work on this, actually. So, people are constantly coming out with new benchmarks that get knocked down almost as soon as they get put up these days. In particular, maybe one that I heard about recently is work by Meter, the evaluations organization, looking at automating AI R&D, where they found that current systems can outperform extremely talented coders given 4 hours to work on a problem. And so, once we start automating AI R&D, I think it's pretty easy to see how we might be on the path towards superintelligent systems, because we can then start to do what's been called recursive self-improvement, leading to an intelligence explosion. So that's just one example, but we're seeing incredible progress in maths and planning. Basically, almost any benchmarks that you look at these days are just getting knocked down very rapidly. So I'm not sure, maybe you had in mind more things like related to CBRN risk or like things like this, and I think that is also something that is very much in active development. We saw OpenAI mentioning that, as Joshua mentioned, their models have gone from low to medium risk in the span of, a year, right? So I think there's plenty of signs already that we should be very concerned, but I'd be very interested in, more discussion about what particular markers might be needed to move policymakers. My impression is that policymakers are mostly ignorant and that people are not having the courage to stand up and say this is a real concern because they look around and see that other people are not taking it seriously enough yet and they don't want to look foolish or be discredited. So I think it's more of a social problem in my mind.
Can we take a couple questions, batch them, and then our panelists can comment on whichever ones they'd like. But thank you.
Not to pick on Aaron, but I guess this is directed. I was thinking about the death by PowerPoint theme in your comments, and I was reminded of Diane Vaughan's work on the Challenger disaster and how they were discussing the risk of the O-rings and whether they were too cold to launch. And if you review that case, the risk of the O-rings being too cold to launch was like a sub-bullet, 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 sub-bullet in a PowerPoint deck, and that turned out to be the crucial failure mode. And so I was wondering if you could speak to, if we introduce LLMs to process millions of decks that contain possibly critical safety risks or critical errors, does this help or compound or exacerbate the risks of hiding, critical information?
So 2 quick comments. One is we're already doing it. So there's no if we deploy LLMs to process these things, we are. 2, one of the big issues when you have thousands or tens of thousands of PowerPoint slide decks is that actually you have no information because you simply can't access anything that's there. So I would argue that if you have a tool that can actually get at some of that information, even if it fails to get at the O-ring, well, it gave you more than you had before, which was 0, because you simply had no ability to find anything. And so my own personal view is in those applications, this is actually very low risk because even if it gets everything wrong, it still gave you more right than you had before, which was nothing.
Do you want to ask your question as well? And I'll quickly add one to the mix for all of us. Online, they're asking, does the introduction of more multimodal models and decision-making systems introduce other risks that we're not thinking about? Go ahead.
Yeah, and then I guess my question, something I'm thinking about a lot is how we as a society consume the concept of AI, and also how we create this social divide between technical and non-technical people when we think about these technologies. We talk rather than talking about how to communicate effectively what a technology is, or creating metaphors and myths around what the technology can be good for, we sort of reify the knowledge of the technical experts. And so I'm curious to hear thoughts from you guys about whether this is something that can be combated directly in this space, or if it's this broader social phenomenon that can't really be combated, or if you think it's relevant at all.
We have a couple minutes left, so whoever would want to address either of those.
I'll address the last one because I think it's critical actually, because we do need policymakers who understand the technical issues. And one of the challenges in the early days, I remember in 2015, talking to government officials about autonomous weapons, and possible sort of developments of AI and autonomy. There was a conversation where they just thought you watch too much science fiction or something. And I think that has to change. We need, technical expertise within the institutions and regulations, and indeed we need these people to feel empowered. So yesterday I brought up this point by the UK, technology secretary, who's we have to treat tech companies like nation states. Or I think it's really important to combat that, supreme knowledge of the tech expert. Nothing against tech experts, guys, but just to say that, these are oftentimes not technical problems, right? What we were talking about are political issues at the end of the day. they have technical dimensions to them, but the challenge, the struggle oftentimes is not the technical aspect, it's the political, and it's the socio-political and socioeconomic aspects. We're talking about smaller states. You can hamper sort of the compute power of smaller states by a few larger states. Those are the kinds of, broader geopolitical considerations to take into mix. But I really think we need the translators, right? Like what Aaron's doing, what others are doing. We need the translators so we avoid the hype as well. And just briefly on the first AGI thing, since 2023 to now, about 150,000 people have been killed in the Sudan. When have you seen a headline on this lately? Or when have you, so yes, in some time these other problems will emerge, but we have people dying now, we have issues now, we have to address now. And I think it's really important to sort of think about, as policymakers, how do you respond to numerous and coming challenges and climate change, So I think, yes, more expertise, more technical expertise, more people like myself who have to learn about, technical aspects of these discussions, and more of these engagements, I think, are absolutely critical.
If I may, I don't know if anyone online. Okay, thanks. Just really quickly on the technical aspect, the kind of siloing or siloed communities. Two quick points. First, it doesn't help that within UN processes, often discussions are between states and non-state actors, civil society, researchers. It may be difficult for them to participate, but also provide their expertise, as some forums are not set up for that. So that is one factor which doesn't help. And actually, I think the HRAIM process has been very beneficial in that it was not just for state actors, but it was much broader and involved non-state actors. And I think that's really important to be able to have this dialogue. But the other one I think is also stems from perhaps the kind of academic researcher communities, to the lack perhaps of incentives to translate academic research. I have noticed that increasingly journals sometimes ask for a lay audience abstract, which is really great, and I think that should be generalized and have a process by which sometimes these very complex papers are translated into just simple terms or for policy audiences so as to not lose them. Also, the fact that these papers are often behind paywalls doesn't really help for kind of the non-technical community to get access as well to this information. So I think there's issues on both sides of the equations, and having dialogues like this I think is really helpful.
And just a quick response on your question about multimodal models. So definitely this is where things are going. There are already a lot of multimodals out there that are being used in military applications. But from a technical side, broadly speaking, with multimodal models, what we're finding is that the vulnerability surface of multimodal models, as you add modalities, the vulnerability surface grows faster than the robustness that you gain from adding the modalities. And so that's something that we're really working hard on right now, is to try to understand that when do you actually gain from adding additional modalities in a simultaneous model, as opposed to serial analysis of different modalities.
Awesome. Hey, Vanina, do you have any pre-lunch words?
No, I think that my colleagues here have covered everything. Just maybe the only thing is as a technical person, I really agree with that we need translations. I've been making a big effort in the last 10 years to try to myself being less technical when I speak, and try to use more lay terms. But it's very hard because my background doesn't allow me to think outside of the technical box, of the mathematical or logical box. So it is really a problem that we have to do something about it right now. And I think it starts with education and the curricula that from both sides of the spectrum. We need to have more knowledge on the other side.
Just for me on the multimodal, one of the places to go looking is the new OSINT tools, the open source intelligence toolkits that are actually available to the public. We can go and actually play around with kind of knitting together different model types that are kind of interesting, but broadly I agree with Aaron. And then just on the community point there, I mean, not to be self-congratulatory, but like universities, right? If I had it my way, we wouldn't graduate masters in public policy without a master's in engineering and vice versa, because you need to have both. And I worked in the national lab context that Aaron discussed, and we had a lot of engineers that didn't know what they were making the widgets for, and a lot of policymakers that didn't understand technology. And so we need to battle that. And so universities are kind of, my theory of victory in that space. So I know it's the same at Mila as well.
Thank you all for being an excellent panel, and please give a round of applause for them.